As the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, progresses, the Department of Health and Human Services is taking away the religious freedom that all Americans are guaranteed by the First Amendment by requiring that all employers, regardless of religious conscience, provide all forms of contraception to their employees and even to minors without the knowledge of their parents. In response to this assault on the Constitution, Catholic leaders are stepping up and are searching for what can be done within the bounds of the law to deliver quality health care that follows the ethical and religious directives for Catholic health care services. The Make Straight the Pathway Conference was held in Houston, Texas in March of 2013 on the campus of the University of St. Thomas to shed light on the critical problem of providing quality health care and protecting everyone's religious freedoms.
I want to kind of start on the issue of government and faith from a 30,000-foot view. I want to show you kind of where we are today and then take you back to where we've been and see if we can find some applications out of that. So starting with where we are today, we are a very, very blessed people, despite the things that we complain about often. We have been blessed with a form of government unlike any other in the world. There's 192 nations at the UN this year, and that number goes up and down every year. But of those nations, we are the only one who's been under the same form of government for 236 years. Same piece of paper for that entire time. If you look at Europe, and Europe is considered to be somewhat stable, France has had 15 constitutions in the same time we've had one. Poland has had 7 constitutions since 1917. Russia has 4 since Poland's 7 since 1919. Russia has 4 since 1917. Afghanistan's had 5 constitutions since 1923. Every other nation seems to average a revolution or a turnover in government every generation or so, not us. We've had one for that entire duration of time. That's unprecedented. In the same way, our prosperity is unlike any other nation in the world. We have only 4% of the world's population, and yet we produce 31% of the world's GDP. And we don't produce more because we have more, because Asia and South America, Africa, all have more natural resources than we do, but somehow we've been able to take what we have and make it more productive than any other nation. Now, all of this is called American exceptionalism. That was a term given us years ago by Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to America in 1831. That's where we get the term. But we've been different for the reason of a philosophy, quite frankly. Ideas lead to results. And so we've had ideas that have been different from other nations. And that's what I want to hit for a moment, is what philosophy caused us to have the stability and the prosperity that we have. And then go back to our founding document, to our birth certificate. In that birth certificate, in 45 words, our founding fathers told the rest of the world, as they said, they wanted to tell the other nations why we were doing what we were doing. They set forth our philosophy of government. Actually, in the first 155 words, they set forth 6 principles of government. Every one of those 6 principles of government is embodied in the U.S. Constitution. But I want to take the first 45 words and look at the first 3 principles of government. These were number 1, 2, 3 on their list of 6 principles. You start with a statement that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, in those 45 words, there are 3 points. Let me take the first phrase, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. From this, the first point we're told is they believe that from an official government standpoint that there is a divine creator. This was not a declaration of private individuals. This was an announcement to the world of what we in the United States, the Continental Congress, were telling them on why we were doing what we're doing. So it's an official public declaration that we believe officially that there's a God. Now, it's significant that after we'd gone through the revolution, we established the Constitution, Washington becomes our first president. On the day that they finished the Bill of Rights, they, on that day, asked President Washington to declare a national day of Thanksgiving. It was the first national day of Thanksgiving we had in America. We'd had some as the Continental Congress, but the first time in the federal capacity. And Washington issued this proclamation. And by the way, we've been very blessed. We own about 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I own thousands of the handwritten documents of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, etc. This is the original proclamation that was issued by George Washington in 1789. What's significant is why did he issue a national Thanksgiving proclamation? The very first paragraph, I want you to see the philosophy behind his thinking. Why was it that he called the people to stop and acknowledge God and thank God? This is what he said. He said, it is the duty, and I would emphasize the word duty. That's a strong word that we don't use in this generation near as much as previous generations. I think military and other folks still understand the concept of duty, but it is a word that has consequences with it. But he said it's the duty of all nations to do 4 things. Nations are, number 1, to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Number 2, they are to obey His will. Number 3, nations are to be grateful for His benefits. And number 4, nations are humbly to implore His protection and favor. And please notice that it's nations. It's not individuals. So this is a corporate responsibility we have as a people to acknowledge God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. And so convinced were they of how important this was as a people and a country that even if you take one of our least religious founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, in 1781 he wrote a book. He did actually 2 books in his lifetime. The first that he did in 1781, in that book, there is a statement that is now engraved in stone inside the Jefferson Memorial. Look what Jefferson himself said. He said, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove their only firm basis?" Now, according to Thomas Jefferson, our least religious founding father, what is the only firm basis of national liberties? He said, it is a conviction, and I would emphasize the word conviction. It is a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they're not to be violated, but with His wrath. He said, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and His justice cannot sleep forever." Now, Jefferson says the only way you can preserve your liberties is you have to have a conviction in your mind that those liberties come from God, and that if you start messing with them, you're going to tick Him off, and then we're all going to be in trouble. So that's the conviction of Jefferson, least religious founding father. There's nothing secular in their thinking on this, whether it be Washington or Jefferson or any others. What you have is a clear conviction that we in a government position, as a government setting, believe that there is a divine creator. So that is the first of those 45 words, the first point there. The second point, let me point you to the phrase where they said that we're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. From that, the second point we hold in government is that there are certain rights that come from God, not government. Now, defining an inalienable right is a lot of fun. If you look at definitions, for example, offered by John Adams defined an inalienable right this way. He says, inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly government. They're rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws. They're rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. There's a certain set of rights we got just because we're human beings, period, across the board. No government gave them. You find these rights given in the Scriptures before there was ever a government in place. They're God-given rights. So we start with a group of, as he said, antecedent rights. These are rights that came from God before God ever created civil government. The rights that come from Him. I also love the way that Alexander Hamilton talks about these rights. He says, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They're not in government documents. He says, they're written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the aid of the divinity itself and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. These aren't rights that you find in a document. These are rights that come from God before there was ever a government in place. So that's the second thing we say. We say there is a God and He gives a certain set of guaranteed rights. Now, what are found in those rights? Well, when you look at what's included in inalienable rights, those who wrote the documents talking about inalienable rights tell us what they are. For example, if you take Sam Adams, and Sam Adams is called the father of the American Revolution, he said, well, we told you in the document that there were 3 among others. And he said those 3 were, first, a right to life, secondly, to liberty, and thirdly, to property. Now, we're used to hearing life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. They defined happiness as the ability to pursue, to acquire, to own, to possess, and to enjoy your own private property. At that point in time, king owned everything, but the ability to have private property was unusual in Europe and a lot of places, and that's what they call the pursuit of happiness, which is why to this day we still say that the American dream is what? It's owning your own home. It's having private property. So life, liberty, and property were 3 God-given rights that preceded any human government, but as the Declaration said, these 3 were among others. And so 11 years later, when we had finished the revolution and we've written the Constitution and we're now writing the Bill of Rights, they went back and said, you remember we told you there were 3 among others? Let us give you some of the others. And so the Bill of Rights goes through and lists other unalienable rights, rights that come from God, not government. The right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, the biblical right of self-defense, the sanctity of the home. Go through all the amendments. They're all God-given rights. They were all set apart from government. Government was not to touch those rights. That was the clear belief is these come from God, therefore government can't regulate them. By the way, let me point out that here in Texas, we used to have this philosophy very clearly. Our Supreme Court of Texas, back in 1913, dealt with the issue of civil unions back in 1913. At that point in time, the Supreme Court of Texas has now said, well, it says, marriage was created when God made Adam and he made Eve and put them together and they had a family. And it went through and said, marriage is a biblical institution created by God. We in civil government have no right to regulate something we didn't create. It is His institution. They said it would be sacrilegious to call a civil contract when it's something that God created. We have no authority to regulate something He created. So that was the belief on the separation of jurisdictions. If it was from God, if it's an inalienable right, government cannot touch that, whether it was marriage or anything else. So that is the second belief that we hold, is number one, there is a divine creator. Number two, He gives certain guaranteed rights. And look at the third part of those 45 words. It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, their belief was that government exists to protect inalienable rights. That's the first purpose of government, is to protect inalienable rights. A number of founding fathers made this very clear. James Wilson is one of only 6 founding fathers who signed the Declaration and the Constitution. He's the second most active member of the Constitutional Convention. George Washington actually put him on the U.S. Supreme Court as an original justice. He started the first law school in America. I have his original legal documents where he was teaching students. And James Wilson was very clear. He says, the principal object of government, number one thing of government, is to acquire a new security for the enjoyment of rights which we were previously entitled by the immediate gift of our all-wise and all-beneficent Creator. If God has given us an inalienable right, the principal purpose of government is to make sure that we can pursue the right that God's given us. So that was understood as being the purpose of government. Now, beyond that, we can talk about other things that government does, but the number one purpose of government was to protect inalienable rights. Sam Adams said a very similar thing. Sam Adams says government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. Now, this is when he also said, and by the way, those rights are the right to life, to liberty, and to property. That's why government was instituted, is to protect those issues. And in this day and age, we think, wouldn't it be really good if that thing about the right to life had applied to abortion, But we've been dealing with the March for Life for 40 years and et cetera. If they'd just been talking about abortion, it would help us today, and I don't know why we think they weren't talking about abortion. The Bible says there is nothing new under the sun. As long as people have been pregnant, there were people who didn't want to be pregnant. Abortion is nothing new. As a matter of fact, in the collection of works that we have, here's a book on abortion in America back in 1808. It is not a new issue. It has not been a new issue. What has changed is technology. So when he says a right to life, literally, that's what he means. And other founding fathers wrote about that. Let me take you back for a moment to James Wilson. This is what James Wilson wrote in his law book, telling students about laws. He says, with consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life, from its commencement to its close, is protected by the common law. He said, in the contemplations of law, life begins when the infant is first able to stir in the womb, and by the law, that life is protected. Now, the point of technology is, as soon as you know there's an infant inside, it's protected by the common law. And by the way, the common law is nothing light. In the 7th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the common law is incorporated in the Constitution. Abortion was a violation of common law. The Constitution had a clause that says you can't do abortion because it's part of the common law. If you looked in any law book of the day at common law offenses, abortion was a common law offense. Therefore, it's in the 7th Amendment. So these guys made it as clear as they could. I mean, it was all there. But again, as soon as you know there's life inside, it's protected at that point. This is where technology is different. Now with a blood test, we can know in 10 days or so? Back then, it would take you weeks, maybe a couple months. But as soon as you knew there was life inside, you do nothing at all to damage that life because it's from God. Now, signer of the Declaration, John Witherspoon, actually took a step further and he said, this is what makes a difference between America and Europe. He said in Europe, they believe that parents create children. And therefore, in Europe, they allow abortions in Europe. He said, but in America, we don't believe parents create children. We believe God creates children. Therefore, we do not allow abortions here because life comes from God, not from parents. Now, see, this is something that they talked about, they wrote about. It was in the law books. Abortion was a common law offense, a violation of common law. So they did talk about the right to life. Now, I will tell you very specifically what I have learned over time. I held a political office here in Texas for 9 years. I work with hundreds of candidates on a regular basis. There are probably 120 members of Congress I consider very close friends. We have a legislative network of about 700 state legislators that we deal with from across the nation, all 50 states. I do all sorts of trainings for candidates. I recruit candidates. I do consulting work with candidates. I've worked with thousands of candidates, thousands of elected officials. What I have learned is if I can find where someone is on the life issue, If I can find where, I don't care whether the dog catcher or President of the United States, if I can find where they are on the life issue with a 90% degree of certainty, I will tell you how they will vote on every other issue they face. If I know where they are in life, I can tell you how they're going to vote on stimulus bills and TARP and bailout. If I know where they are in life, I'll tell you where they are in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Any issue that comes up with a 90% degree of certainty, and the reason is very simple. Life is the first of the inalienable rights. If they will not protect the first of the inalienable rights, they don't protect the second, third, fourth, fifth. That's why someone who's wrong on the life issue is usually wrong on the First Amendment right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. Those that do not respect life do not respect your right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. And you'll find that one that violates life is willing to violate conscience. You'll find that if they're wrong on the life issue, they're wrong on the biblical right of self-defense. And by the way, we call it the right to keep and bear arms. The Founding Fathers called it a biblical right of self-defense. They pointed to Exodus 22. They pointed to Nehemiah, 2 chapters of Nehemiah. Lots of places they pointed to. It's a God-given right to defend yourself. That's even a right of nature. You start messing with animals that have young and see what happens when you do. It's part of the laws of nature. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the Third Amendment sanctity of the home. And isn't it interesting how those that are wrong on life are wrong on traditional marriage? You get one wrong, you get the other wrong. If you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on the Fifth Amendment right of protection of private property. You'll think the government has a right to take private property. But if you're wrong on the life issue, why not? If you violate one inalienable right, you'll violate the others because you don't respect those God-given lines. So across the board, you look at these kind of issues, and if you're wrong on the life issue, you'll be wrong on everything else, which is why Sam Adams says, first is a right to life. So, and by the way, I also have part of a presentation I do a lot of times where I'll show you that if they're wrong on the life issue, I'll show you what their economic voting record looks like as well. If they're wrong on the life, but it makes sense. If they don't protect your life, they're not going to protect your money. Your life's more important than your money. So across the board, that is a philosophy that tells you, and that's why when I deal with any candidate, I mean, I get a dog catcher come and say, will you endorse me for office? I say, wait a minute. I want to know your stand on abortion. Wait a minute, I'm a dog catcher. I got nothing to do with abortion. Right, but if I know where you stand on abortion, I know your whole philosophy on government, plus the fact that you may not stay dog catcher. You might run for city council and then mayor and the state representative and the governor, and it's a whole lot easier to knock you off as a dog catcher than it is to knock you off as a governor. So across the board, that is the standard for people in office. If you don't get the life issue right, you'll get everything else wrong, just with very few exceptions. So that is the third aspect of our philosophy of government. 1, there's a creator. 2, he gives guaranteed rights. 3, government exists primarily to protect the rights that he gives. Now, with all these 3 points, one of the rights, and this is the one that I'm trying to get to, is the rights of conscience, the sacred rights of conscience. Let me go to James Madison for a moment. James Madison, and by the way, I guess the background to where the Founding Fathers are, we go back into the early colonies. We own so many of the original writings and original laws of those early colonies, and you find that in the early colonies, just across the board, they gave explicit protection for the rights of conscience, because across Europe, the rights of conscience were being violated. If you believed the wrong thing, you could find yourself dead, quite frankly. There's just so many examples of it. You know, in England, you had 20,000 Puritans who criticized the church, the state-established church. You had Henry VIII and Elizabeth and James and all these others, and they didn't like the stuff that was going on. So simply for criticizing and saying, look, as we read the Bible, we're not supposed to be doing this kind of stuff. At that point, the government took and slit the noses of 20,000 of them, sliced off their ears and chopped their tongues and said, now let's see you complain about it. Simply for talking about what they believed the Bible. So across Europe, you had people who didn't always agree with one another, but as they tried to follow the Bible, they were being killed, persecuted, whatever. So we have across America this huge protection for rights of conscience. John Quincy Adams said very simply, he said, the transcendent and overruling principle of the first settlers in New England was conscience. That's what drove people here. And so when they got here, guess what? They wanted to protect rights of conscience. Then as you get into the American Revolution, we now separate from Great Britain, and so we're required to write state constitutions because we no longer have state governments or no longer have colonial governments. So explicit protection you find all over those early constitutions. I mean, this is a long-standing tradition in America, is protection for the rights of conscience. Now, James Madison understood that, and this is what James Madison said. He said, government is instituted to protect property of every sort. Remember, government's protecting inalienable rights, those first three inalienable rights, life, liberty, property. He said, government's instituted to protect property of every sort. He said, conscience is the most sacred of all property. Now, we think of property sometimes as real estate. Conscience is property. Government exists to protect property, of which conscience is the most important part of property. You also have George Washington, who talked about the rights of conscience in this way. He said we should be very cautious of violating the rights of conscience in others, ever considering that God alone is the judge of the hearts of men, and to Him only they're answerable. Government doesn't judge the hearts of men. Therefore, government has to say, all right, I may not agree with you, but I respect your right of conscience because you answer to God. You don't answer to government for what you do. And that was the belief that we held across the board. And so that was the belief the Founding Fathers had. I mean, look at all the colonies. You had state-established churches in more than half of them, and they weren't the state-established church. Even the colonies didn't agree with each other. There's a huge ton of difference, but we respect the rights of conscience with people who just, South Carolina had a different state church than what Massachusetts did. That's all right. They still respected each other's rights. They didn't agree with each other, but they still... See, that's the tradition that we had for a long time. And that's why when you look at how we protected rights, in the Constitutional Convention, when they wrote it, you take John Jay. John Jay, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, one of the three men most responsible for us having the Constitution today, he did the Federalist Papers. After the Constitution's all done, John Jay says very simply, he says, security under our Constitution is given to the rights of conscience and private judgment. They are by nature subject to no control but that of the deity, and in that free situation they are now left. What we have just done is put it off limits to government. Government cannot touch the rights of conscience, period. They're supposed to be free. They're supposed to be left between the individual and God, and we've now protected that. Now, that was the belief of what they had done, and they were very clear on that belief. William Livingston is a guy that I want to spend a little bit of time on. William Livingston was actually a signer of the Constitution from New Jersey. He was a governor of New Jersey. He was a general in the American Revolution. He actually was a missionary. When he was 14 years old, he was living among the Mohawk Indians as a missionary. So he has a strong faith connection, strong political connection, one of the guys who wrote the Constitution, and he's very pointed on what he said about conscience. For what business, in the name of common sense, has the magistrate to do with our religion? The state does not have a concern in the matter. He says, in what manner does it affect society? In what outward form we think it best to pay our adoration to God? The consciences of men are not the objects of human legislation. Now, that's pretty simple stuff. Magistrate has nothing to do with what we believe, think, or how we perform our belief and worship to God. He said, in contrast with this spiritual tyranny, notice that if you violate the rights of conscience, they call it tyranny. That's a pretty strong word. In contrast with this spiritual tyranny, how beautiful appears our Constitution in disclaiming all jurisdiction over the souls of men, securing by a never-to-be-repealed section the voluntary, unchecked moral persuasion of every person by his own self-directed communication with the Father of spirits. We just guaranteed through the Constitution that government's not going to get involved in religious beliefs and practices. Now, this is where it gets fun, because these guys were very familiar with the concept of separation of church and state. You will find that concept enshrined throughout their writings. Enshrined, now, they didn't use the term the way we use it today, because, and let me make it real clear. First Amendment, this is what we point to for separation of church and state. Okay, this amendment, you read it, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are two clauses there. The first is called the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Congress can't make us all the same religious practice or habit or anything else. And second, Congress can't prohibit the free exercise thereof. That's the Free Exercise Clause. But notice, the only entity limited by the First Amendment is Congress. It doesn't limit individuals, doesn't limit people, doesn't limit hospitals or doctors, doesn't limit kids, it limits Congress. That's because their version of separation of church and state was, it was always the government trying to intrude into religious affairs. They weren't scared of faith. They're scared of the government trying to regulate faith. So when you go back, let me back up for a moment here to Livingston. Livingston said that you can detect a violation of the separation of church and state if government interferes with the rights of conscience. That's interesting. We always get accused of violating separation of church and state because we want to have prayer to graduation, or we want to say God at a football game, or we want to have in God we trust in money, or under God and pledge. Separation of church? No. Separation of church and state occurs when the government gets involved in your rights of conscience. Now, that's what he specifically said. And that's a guy who helped write it. So they were concerned about government intrusion, not about individuals taking their faith into public areas or living out their faith. They're concerned about the government regulating faith, which is why, again, the First Amendment has the Establishment Clause that says Congress can't do anything to make us all the same, and Congress can't do anything to keep us from practicing our faith, and the limitation is on Congress and no other entity. That's the First Amendment. So that's their view of separation of church and state. Because of that, we protect the rights of conscience for all sorts of folks that the country may not agree with. I mean, quite frankly, we protect the rights of conscience for conscientious objectors. As much as we are pro our soldiers and we support our soldiers, we also support the right of people who say, I want nothing to do with that. It had been Quakers at the time of the American Revolution. It's now all sorts of other groups. But we don't force people to fight in wars against their conscience. We have conscience protection also for Jehovah's Witnesses. We patriotic, love the country. We have states across the country saying the Pledge of Allegiance, but we do not require Jehovah's Witnesses to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They believe they pledge only to God loyalty. They don't pledge loyalty to any human authority. So we don't require Jehovah's Witnesses. That's freedom of conscience. We have the same thing with the Amish. You see, everybody else has compulsory education, 12 years of education. Amish say, no, under our faith, 8 years is all you need. 8 years is all we believe the Bible requires. To go, great, have 8 years. We're not going to require you to have 12 like everybody else in the nation. Same Christian Scientists and vaccinations. You got to have vaccination to go to school unless you happen to be Christian Scientists, and then your faith says, we don't do that to our children. So we say, fine, you don't do that to your children. That's the rights of conscience. Same with Muslim and Jewish men not required to shave their beards. You can work into places as you have to be clean shaven. Oh, if you're Jewish or Muslim and you're practicing your faith, you don't have to be clean shaven despite what our policies say. The same with Seventh-day Adventists. I don't want to work on Saturday. Yeah, but my job requires you to work from Monday through Saturday. Well, not for Seventh-day Adventists. They have the right by conscience to not be fired for not working on their day of worship. So we've always protected rights of conscience across the board. What we've seen in the last 6 years particularly has been a restriction on that. You may recall that a lot of the conscience debate has been over medical issues. And as President Bush was leaving office and this stuff was developing and we're trying to figure what we're going to do with this new stuff, he wrote out an executive order to protect the rights of conscience as he was leaving office because a lot of this stuff was still new 5 years ago. The new president comes in and says, no, we're not going to do that conscience protection for medical people, and so reverses the executive order, and then you've seen what's happened with HHS, et cetera. So all the things that we had talked, and by the way, while we're on medicine for a moment, let me take you to a founding father, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who's called the father of American medicine. He is considered the greatest physician in American history. Started the College of Physicians. He actually was professor of medicine at 3 universities at the same time. There are 3,000 students who graduated with medical degrees with his signature on the diplomas of those 3,000 students. I have his original medical writings. They're absolutely phenomenal. He came up with cures 200 years ago that we're still using today. You look at what Benjamin Rush said about conscience and medicine, pretty interesting. This is what he says. He said, should we, and by the way, let me also back up to say, this is no insignificant founding father. In addition to being the father of American medicine, John Adams and others said that Benjamin Rush is one of our 3 most notable founders. They said you have George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Now, he's known for medicine, but he's also known for education. He started 5 universities in his day. 3 of them still go now. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He started academic education for women. He also is a huge civil rights guy, started the first abolition society in America, ran the national abolition movement, helped found the first black denomination in America, trained the first black physicians in America. He did the first faith-based prison reform in America. He signed the Declaration, ratified the Constitution, served in 3 different presidential administrations, was the director of the U.S. Mint. The guy's a Renaissance man. He's into everything. That's why he was such a notable guy. We haven't even heard his name today. Dr. Benjamin Rush said this. He said, should we build facts upon facts until our pile reached the heavens, they would soon tumble to pieces unless they were cemented by principles. Knowledge itself is not sufficient if it's not built on principles. He said, medicine without principles is a degrading occupation. Directed by principles, it imparts the highest elevation to the intellectual and moral character of man. He said, in the writings of St. Paul, conscience is said to be the witness that accuses or excuses us of a breach of the law written in our hearts. He said, the moral faculty performs the office of a lawgiver, while the business of conscience is to perform the duty of judge. So moral stuff tells us what's right and wrong, and conscience says, no, that's wrong. So the conscience is the one that takes moral faculties like the law, and the judge interprets the law and helps apply the law. That's the conscience. The conscience, like a wise and faithful legislative council, performs the office of a check upon the moral faculty and thus prevents the fatal consequences of immoral actions. He says, conscience measures all her actions by the unerring square of right and wrong. The conscience is invisible and therefore removed beyond our investigation. Government can't get involved with conscience. Conscience is invisible. It's what works on inside. It's what God uses. Therefore, government can't investigate the rights of conscience. Can't say, well, I don't really agree with the way you do that. No, that's off limits for government. See, in medicine, we talked about the rights of conscience even back then, and it was off limits to the investigation of government. So when you look at where we are today, by the way, I hope we all understand, and you've seen from the writings of the Founding Fathers, they keep going back to the Bible for those rights of conscience. Because again, we believe there is a Creator. He gives us certain guaranteed rights, and government exists to protect those rights. We know He gave us those rights because they're in the Scriptures. And that's why when you look in the Scriptures, you'll find in the New Testament alone, there are 30 references dealing with the issue of conscience. Of those references, we're specifically told to maintain good conscience. We're also told to respect differences of conscience. We're also told to not wound the conscience of someone else. Across the board, Scriptures just tell us to respect the rights of conscience, verse after verse after verse. So when you have biblical thinking people, you understand that this is a right to be protected. When you have secular thinking people, they don't read the Scriptures, and they don't care what the rights are, and they don't care that they came from God. We believe that all rights are given by man. And see, that was one of the, just to be very blunt, that's one of the difficulties I had when the health care bill was passed, because Congress took to the steps of the Capitol and said, we have now given the people a right to health care. If government gives you a right, it can regulate that right, restrain that right, restrict that right, repeal that right, define that right. If it's a God-given right, they got to leave it alone. So any right that's given by government is going to be regulated by government. And that's why if you do not know the rights of conscience come from God, you'll think, well, out of the generosity of government, we're giving rights of conscience, but we're not giving it to this group or to this practice or this behavior or this belief. Or you can't do that. You just go back to the Scriptures, and that's the basis. Thomas Jefferson acknowledged that. He said, it's inconsistent with the spirit of our laws and Constitution to force tender consciences. We just flat don't do that. He said, our rulers can have authority only over such natural rights as we have submitted to them, and the rights of conscience we never submitted. That's an off-limit area. That came from God. That's between us and God. We didn't give government any authority. It's a jurisdictional issue. He said, no provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience, the First Amendment. So our rights are biblically given. Now here's the side that gets a little tricky. Like with any right, it's biblically, the right to preach the gospel is a biblically given right. God gave us the right to preach the gospel. Jesus in Matthew 28 told us to go preach the gospel. So why don't we go climb up on a street corner in Saudi Arabia and just preach the gospel? Because when you do, you get yourself beheaded, as we have some guys who have been arrested recently for trying to preach the gospel in Saudi Arabia. See, our rights are biblically given, but they have to be politically protected. Just the fact that God told you can do it doesn't mean you can do it, or you can do it, but you may pay a penalty for doing so. And so they're biblically given, they're politically protected. And I'll close with this thought. It comes from John Francis Mercer. He's one of the 55 individuals who gave us the U.S. Constitution. As they were in the midst of framing the U.S. Constitution, this is what John Francis Mercer reminded the other delegates. He says, it's a great mistake to suppose that the Constitution will govern the United States. Isn't that a weird statement? You're in the middle of writing the Constitution. He said, guys, we all understand it's a major league error to think the Constitution is going to govern America. Well, then why are you writing it? He said, it's a mistake to suppose the Constitution will govern the United States. It's the men that it will bring into office and the interest they have in maintaining that will govern them. It's not the Constitution that governs us, it's people that govern us. So the Constitution tells us how to get people in office. If we get the wrong people in office, we're not governed by the Constitution. We're governed by the will of those people, which is why I said the Constitution will only mark out the mode and the form. Elected officials are the substance, and they must do the business. The Constitution is no better than the people that have it in office. And if the people in office don't see the rights of conscience in it, then they're not going to protect the rights of conscience. Whether that's legislatures in New York, legislatures in Illinois, all the state legislatures are trying to squish conscience. Michigan, we've got cases there, cases all over the country. It doesn't matter whether it's local officials or county officials or state officials or federal officials. It's not the document, the laws that govern us. It's the people in office, the philosophy they have. If the document governed us, we wouldn't have any lawsuits for conscience protection because it's pretty clear in the documents you protect conscience. We have lawsuits because we have people in office who don't believe in those things that are in the documents. That's why the political aspect of what goes on with conscience protection is even more important than the historical and legal aspect. If you don't get people in office who believe that you got a right to conscience, we're going to be fighting this battle till we die. So the best way to fix that is put people in office. And so if I take you back to these three principles of American government, there's a divine creator. The divine creator gives inalienable rights to man. Government exists to secure those rights. One thing I can point out for dead certain is a secular government will never be a limited government. You got secular leaders, they will get involved in all sorts of areas that they should not be involved with, including the rights of conscience. Show me any secular government in Europe that has not intruded into the rights of conscience. It won't happen. You have to have leaders who believe there's a creator. He gives rights. Government exists to protect those rights. Therefore, I will not touch those. That's out of my jurisdiction. I can't do that. So there's a political solution to this, but that's the historical history that we have. This is a well-protected, well-defined right in American history. Thank you guys for letting me share with you. Tim, back to you, sir.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gardner, and on behalf of the John Paul II Life Center and the Christus Medicus Foundation, thank you for watching this presentation. The need for more crisis pregnancy centers and Christ-centered medical practices throughout the United States is critical and ongoing, and we'd like to encourage you to get involved. Before you do, there are a couple of important takeaways that we'd like to leave you with. First and foremost, develop a strong and clear vision of what it is you want to create. Be sure that you understand the distinctions between a crisis pregnancy center, a family practice clinic, an OBGYN clinic, a multidisciplinary medical practice, or a sonogram center. Familiarize yourself, too, with the not-for-profit laws as they pertain to healthcare in your state. John Paul II Life Center operates within the state of Texas. Your laws may vary. Also, before you begin either to explore a crisis pregnancy center or a Christ-centered medical practice, get the blessing of your bishop. Get a committed and unified board. If you can, get the cooperation of your local Catholic hospital. Organize and identify physicians who can be key in helping you getting your project off the ground. Develop a strategic plan, and within it, include the right professionals, those that you'll need to advise you in all aspects of your endeavor. Familiarize yourself with the fundamentals of fundraising, communication, and education. Everyone involved does not need to know how to do everything, but everyone involved should know about everything that needs to be done. To open a Christ-centered medical practice, understand the financial operations of a clinic. When considering the financial arrangements needed to establish a clinic, it has been our experience that the first-year costs, including salaries, is a minimum of $500,000 and can be supported by a recruitment agreement for a physician with a cooperating hospital. Also, care should be taken to consult with an appropriate practice management company to assist you in setting up the medical clinic and to get the correct assistance with licensing, credentialing for hospital privileges, and third-party contracts, as well as billing and collections with the best electronic medical records and healthcare information technology available. Right now, a national platform is under development to include a service company that will help take advantage of economies of scale so medical clinics and pro-life centers across the United States can be created. For more information, please contact us at Kimberly at jpiilifecenter.org. That's Kimberly at jpiilifecenter.org.